Welcome to Luxurious Tales, where African folktales come alive with depth, mystery, and meaning. Here, every story carries wisdom, every secret has a consequence, and every ending leaves a mark. If you love powerful stories, don't forget to like, share, and comment. Subscribe to Luxurious Tales and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. Listen closely. The story begins now. Nadia Hartwell's mornings always began the same way, long before the city fully woke up. She rose quietly in her modest one-bedroom apartment, careful not to rush the peace she had learned to protect. The kettle went on first, followed by soft music playing low enough to blend with the hum of the refrigerator. Baking was her refuge, not as a business yet, but as a promise she made to herself that one day, warmth and comfort would have her name on it. As dough rested on the counter, Nadia stretched for her morning run shoes, lacing them with a discipline shaped by years of choosing calm over chaos. Her past had taught her that loud love often hid cruelty, and so she cherished routines that felt steady, honest, and earned. She worked hard, saved carefully, and dreamed quietly of owning a small family-style cafe where people could feel safe, fed, and seen. Nadia believed deeply in forever, not the dramatic kind, but the type built on consistency, patience, and kindness that lasted beyond attraction. Tessa Caldwell, her closest friend and fiercest protector, was the one person allowed to disrupt Nadia's calm without apology. Over coffee later that morning, Tessa leaned across the table, eyes sharp and observant, as she listened to Nadia describe her hopes for the future. Tessa worked in event logistics and had seen too many polished smiles crumble under pressure. She warned Nadia casually, but with intention, about men who were more invested in appearances than substance. Men who love how things look more than how they feel, Tessa said, stirring her drink slowly, usually don't know how to love at all. Nadia smiled, brushing off the comment, but the words lodged themselves somewhere deep. Tessa wasn't cynical, she was experienced. She had watched people trade loyalty for prestige and commitment for convenience. Still, Nadia believed her path would be different. She believed that discernment and kindness could coexist, that choosing peace did not mean settling for less. That belief was quietly tested later that afternoon at a community charity planning committee meeting held in a shared workspace downtown. Nadia had volunteered for logistical coordination, drawn to work that felt purposeful without needing applause. That was where she first noticed Silas Hartwell. He didn't dominate the room or demand attention. Instead, he listened, really listened, and spoke thoughtfully when it mattered. When Nadia offered an idea about reallocating resources more efficiently, Silas backed her immediately, crediting her insight without hesitation. Their brief conversation afterward was easy, almost disarming. He asked about her interests, her work, her dreams, and seemed genuinely intrigued by her calm confidence. There was no pressure, no showmanship, just warmth and attentiveness that felt rare. As Nadia left the meeting, she felt an unfamiliar flutter of curiosity, unaware that this seemingly gentle beginning was the opening move in a story that would one day test every belief she held about love, loyalty, and forever. Silas Hartwell's world was built on polish, not comfort. Every morning began in the Hartwell estate with precision, pressed shirts, measured steps, and conversations that revolved around perception rather than emotion. The Hartwell name carried weight in social and business circles, and Silas had been raised to treat it like fragile glass, admired from a distance, never questioned up close. His mother, Judith Hartwell, ruled the household with quiet authority, her presence filling rooms even when she spoke softly. From an early age, Silas learned that affection was conditional and approval was earned through performance. His achievements were celebrated only when they reflected well on the family, and his failures were handled behind closed doors with sharp words and colder silences. Beneath his tailored confidence lived a constant fear of disappointing the woman who defined success for him long before he understood himself. Judith's lessons were deliberate and relentless. She taught Silas that marriage was not about companionship but alignment, not about love but legacy. Wives, in her view, were accessories, chosen carefully to enhance status, silence gossip, and preserve appearances. Warmth, empathy, or emotional depth were indulgences Judith considered weaknesses. She trained Silas to observe how women carried themselves, where they came from, and how they fit into the Hartwell image. Every dinner conversation doubled as a lesson, every social event a test. Silas absorbed it all, nodding obediently, even as a quiet dissatisfaction settled inside him. He learned how to smile convincingly, how to mirror charm, and how to present humility without ever surrendering control. What Judith called strength, Silas experienced as pressure, and though he rarely questioned her aloud, part of him longed for something softer, something that didn't feel like an audition. That longing was exactly what drew Silas to Nadia. She represented everything his world lacked: ease without arrogance, ambition without cruelty, confidence without performance. Being around her made him feel admired not for his name, but for his presence. Pursuing Nadia felt like rebellion wrapped in romance, a way to assert independence without openly challenging his mother. Yet even as he invited her to coffee, lingered in conversation, and found excuses to see her again, Silas never truly removed the mask Judith had crafted for him. He compartmentalized his life carefully, Nadia in one space, his family in another, believing he could balance both without consequence. What Silas didn't realize was that masks, once worn too long, began to reshape the face beneath them, and the man Nadia was getting to know was already fractured between who he wanted to be and who he had been trained to become. The Hartwell dinner was nothing like Nadia had imagined, though she had prepared herself for discomfort. The house itself felt less like a home and more like a carefully preserved exhibit, everything polished, nothing warm. Nadia arrived in a simple, elegant dress she had chosen deliberately, hoping to balance respect with authenticity. Judith Hartwell greeted her with a smile that never reached her eyes, complimenting the dress while subtly noting it was refreshingly modest for such an occasion. The table conversation flowed around Nadia rather than to her, filled with references she didn't recognize and inside jokes she wasn't meant to understand. Judith asked questions that sounded polite but landed like tests, about Nadia's upbringing, her parents' professions, her long-term ambitions. Each inquiry carried an unspoken judgment, measuring Nadia against an invisible standard she had never agreed to meet. Despite the tension, Nadia held herself with quiet grace. She answered honestly without oversharing, smiled without shrinking, and refused to apologize for who she was. Her composure didn't go unnoticed by Miles Hartwell, Silas's younger brother, who sat across from her observing the exchange with growing discomfort. Unlike Silas, Miles had long rejected the rigid expectations of the Hartwell name, choosing a life that valued honesty over prestige. When Judith excused herself briefly, Miles leaned toward Nadia and murmured a gentle apology, acknowledging that first dinners were often rougher than necessary. His sincerity surprised her. Later, as dessert was served, Miles made a point to include Nadia in conversation, subtly disrupting Judith's attempts to isolate her. It was the first small sign that not everyone in the Hartwell family saw her as disposable. That night, after Nadia had gone, Judith wasted no time. She confronted Silas in her private sitting room, pearls resting neatly at her throat like armor. Her tone was calm but unmistakably final as she dismissed Nadia as temporary, a pleasant distraction that had no place in the Hartwell legacy. Judith reminded Silas of his responsibilities, her disappointment sharpened by the fact that he had brought Nadia into their world at all. She spoke of upgrades, of alliances, of women who understood what it meant to carry a name like Hartwell. Silas listened in silence, his jaw tight, offering no defense. In that moment, the first real fracture formed, between the woman he claimed to care for and the mother whose approval still ruled him. And though Silas told himself he could manage both, Judith already knew something he did not. Once she decided someone didn't belong, she never stopped until they were gone. After the Hartwell dinner, Silas changed his pace with Nadia almost overnight. He began calling more often, planning elaborate dates that felt intentionally grand, as though scale could compensate for uncertainty. Weekend trips were booked without much discussion, reservations made at places that emphasized exclusivity rather than intimacy. Silas spoke freely about the future, marriage, shared homes, a life that sounded dazzling when described aloud. To Nadia, the attention felt intoxicating and unsettling at the same time. She had never been pursued with such intensity, and part of her wondered if this was what certainty looked like when it arrived boldly instead of quietly. Silas seemed eager to lock something down, to define them before doubts could breathe. The speed felt flattering, yet it also created a strange pressure, as though slowing down would mean losing something fragile and rare. In moments of quiet, Nadia's past resurfaced in ways she rarely shared. She told Silas about growing up in a household where love had been inconsistent, where promises were made easily and broken without apology. Stability, to her, was not about luxury but about presence, knowing someone would still be there when excitement faded. She confessed her fear of being chosen passionately and then discarded once she no longer served a purpose. Silas listened attentively, offering reassurance that sounded sincere, but his responses were often polished rather than probing. He promised safety, devotion, and partnership, yet rarely asked how Nadia needed to be loved. Still, she wanted to believe him. His certainty contrasted so sharply with her caution that she wondered if she was finally learning to trust instead of guard. While Nadia leaned into hope, Tessa grew uneasy. From the outside, Silas's stories didn't always align. Dates shifted without explanation, details about his schedule blurred, and his availability seemed curated rather than natural. Tessa began paying closer attention, quietly cross-checking information and noticing subtle inconsistencies that didn't sit right. She raised concerns gently, careful not to sound accusatory, but Nadia wasn't ready to hear them. The relationship still felt new, electric, and full of promise. Doubt felt like sabotage. Nadia believed that love deserved patience and optimism, not suspicion. What she didn't realize was that speed often hides intention, and the louder love announces itself, the harder it becomes to hear the truths whispering beneath it. The wedding unfolded like a spectacle curated for admiration rather than intimacy. Every detail was immaculate, from the venue's pristine symmetry to the guest list that read like a catalogue of influence. Nadia stood at the center of it all, radiant yet faintly disoriented, sensing that the celebration belonged more to the Hartwell name than to the union itself. Judith moved through the event with practiced elegance, greeting guests as if she were hosting a corporate gala rather than welcoming a new daughter-in-law. Her compliments toward Nadia were measured and public, carefully chosen to appear generous while maintaining control. Silas seemed proud, almost relieved, basking in approval that came easily now that expectations had been met. Nadia smiled through the ceremony, believing that commitment would soften edges, unaware that marriage, and this family, was less a bond and more an acquisition. The following morning delivered Judith's first gift, presented with ceremonial warmth. It was a leather-bound planner, customized with the Hartwell crest, filled not with blank pages but with suggestions, dress codes for events, etiquette reminders, preferred social circles, and notes on how a Hartwell wife should present herself. Judith framed it as guidance, insisting she only wanted to help Nadia adjust smoothly. Nadia thanked her politely, though discomfort crept in as she flipped through pages that outlined expectations she had never agreed to. Even choices she thought personal, what meals to serve, how often to host, which acquaintances were appropriate, had been pre-decided. The gift wasn't malicious on the surface, but its message was unmistakable: individuality was negotiable, conformity was not. Nadia felt the invisible chain settle gently, disguised as care. Silas noticed Nadia's unease but chose reassurance over confrontation. He promised her that his mother meant well, that adaptation was temporary, and that their life together would ultimately be theirs to shape. His words were soothing, but his actions told a different story. When Judith corrected Nadia, Silas stayed silent. When expectations tightened, he encouraged patience instead of resistance. He spoke of balance while consistently bending toward his mother's will. Nadia told herself that marriages required compromise, that blending families was never easy. Still, a quiet fear stirred, the sense that love alone might not be enough to loosen chains forged by legacy and control. What she didn't yet understand was that the first test of loyalty had already been given, and Silas had answered without speaking at all. Bianca Rowe entered Silas's life without announcement, the way storms often do, quiet at first, almost welcome. She appeared at an exclusive business dinner hosted by one of the Hartwell family's long-standing associates, a carefully curated evening meant to strengthen alliances rather than build friendships. Bianca carried herself with effortless confidence, fluent in the language of influence, laughter measured and eyes observant. She spoke with ease about travel, philanthropy, and the subtle art of being indispensable in elite circles. Silas noticed how naturally she fit into the room, how no one questioned her presence or origins. When introduced, Bianca offered a warm smile that lingered just long enough to feel personal. Unlike Nadia's gentle curiosity, Bianca's attention felt deliberate, focused, and quietly flattering. She asked Silas questions that made him feel admired for his ambition rather than evaluated for his integrity. Bianca's background was layered, shaped by a childhood where security was uncertain and comfort had to be negotiated. She learned early that stability rarely arrived through patience alone. Observing power taught her how proximity could transform circumstances, and she honed her instincts accordingly. Bianca wasn't cruel by nature, but she was strategic, believing that survival required adaptability and boldness. She admired wealth not for luxury alone, but for the freedom it promised. Men like Silas represented access to protection, influence, and a world she had learned to navigate expertly. To Bianca, relationships were rarely accidental, they were opportunities shaped by timing and intent. She recognized Silas's vulnerability instantly, the need to be admired without judgment, the fatigue of living up to inherited expectations. What began as casual conversation shifted into something more intimate through messages exchanged after the dinner. Silas told himself it was harmless, just friendly banter that offered relief from the tension waiting for him at home. Bianca listened when he complained about pressure, about being misunderstood, about the weight of responsibility. She validated his frustrations without challenging him, subtly positioning herself as the one who truly understood him. Silas didn't see it as betrayal, only escape. He compartmentalized easily, convincing himself that emotional distance wasn't infidelity. But lines blurred quickly, and what felt like harmless attention soon became a secret he protected. Without realizing it, Silas had opened a door he would later pretend he never meant to unlock, unaware that Bianca had already stepped fully inside. Nadia threw herself into shaping the Hartwell house into something that felt lived in rather than displayed. She rearranged spaces to invite conversation, planned meals that carried comfort instead of ceremony, and tried to establish rhythms that felt like home. Yet every attempt seemed to trigger a correction. Judith critiqued decor choices as too casual, questioned menus for lacking sophistication, and suggested guest lists that prioritized optics over intimacy. Even Nadia's daily schedule became subject to review: when she woke, whom she met, how long she stayed out. The house began to feel less like a refuge and more like a venue under inspection. Nadia noticed how her decisions were quietly overridden, her preferences reframed as mistakes that required guidance. Each comment was small enough to dismiss individually, but together they formed a constant hum of disapproval that eroded her sense of belonging. Judith soon enlisted Aunt Celeste Hartwell under the pretense of support. Celeste presented herself as gracious and understanding, offering advice in soft tones that masked sharper intent. She framed control as care, suggesting ways Nadia could ease tension by anticipating Judith's expectations before they were voiced. Celeste spoke often about sacrifice and loyalty, reminding Nadia that harmony depended on flexibility, specifically, hers. Nadia tried to listen politely, but something about Celeste's counsel felt calculated, as though every suggestion narrowed her choices further. Conversations left Nadia unsettled, unsure whether she was being guided or managed. The alliance between Judith and Celeste became increasingly apparent, a quiet partnership designed to reinforce boundaries Nadia hadn't agreed to cross. What unsettled her most was how seamlessly they worked together, as if rehearsed. Amid the mounting pressure, Nadia began noticing changes in Silas. His phone was always face down. Notifications were muted. He stepped away to take calls and returned with rehearsed explanations that sounded plausible but hollow. When she asked simple questions, he deflected, claiming work demanded discretion. Nadia wanted to trust him, yet patterns formed that were difficult to ignore. Messages disappeared, conversations felt truncated. Silas grew impatient when she pressed, accusing her of overthinking. The more he dismissed her concerns, the sharper her intuition became. Nadia didn't confront him directly, at least not yet. Instead, she observed, listened, and learned. The home she had hoped to nurture now felt like a courtroom where evidence was quietly accumulating, and she was the only one aware that a trial had already begun. Miles Hartwell invited Nadia to his garage on a quiet evening when the city felt uncharacteristically still. The space smelled of oil and metal, a stark contrast to the pristine Hartwell estate. Miles moved with ease among half-finished repairs, his hands busy as if the work gave him courage. He offered Nadia a stool and spoke without preamble, telling her he'd watched too many women walk into the Hartwell family believing love would protect them. He explained how the family measured worth through compliance, how anyone who didn't fit the mold was slowly squeezed out through pressure that left no visible bruises. His voice carried frustration, not bitterness. He loved his brother, but he hated what the family did to people who trusted them. Nadia listened carefully, sensing that this conversation had been building for a long time. Miles went further, revealing a story he rarely shared. Years earlier, Silas had dated a woman who challenged Judith's authority, refusing to be managed. Judith responded not with confrontation, but with whispers, questioning her stability, her motives, her past. Legal pressure followed, threats disguised as advice, until the woman left town exhausted and humiliated. Silas hadn't defended her then either. Miles admitted that he had tried to intervene but lacked influence within the family hierarchy. The confession landed heavily on Nadia, reframing moments she had brushed aside as misunderstandings. What she thought were isolated tensions now looked like patterns. Miles didn't tell her to leave, he simply wanted her to see clearly. "They don't fight you outright," he said quietly. "They wait until you doubt yourself." That night, Nadia began doing something she had never imagined herself doing, documenting. Not out of spite or vengeance, but out of instinct. She noted dates, comments, changes in behavior, moments that felt off. Screenshots replaced assumptions, facts replacing feelings. She told herself it was temporary, just a precaution, because part of her still hoped love could overcome conditioning. She believed that if Silas truly saw what was happening, he would choose her. Yet even as she wrote, a subtle shift occurred. Nadia was no longer simply enduring, she was preparing. The garage conversation didn't make her fearless, but it gave her clarity. And clarity, she would soon learn, was far more dangerous to the Hartwell family than anger ever could be. The discovery came quietly, wrapped in disbelief and trembling joy. Nadia stared at the test in the soft light of the bathroom, her breath shallow as hope rose faster than fear. She pressed a hand to her stomach, imagining a future suddenly more vivid than anything she had planned, a child who would anchor her, a life that might finally soften the edges of the Hartwell household. She told Silas that evening with a smile she couldn't contain, her voice catching as she spoke. For a moment, he looked genuinely moved, pulling her into an embrace that felt protective and proud. In public, his excitement was immediate, rehearsed almost, as though the news completed an image he'd been waiting to present. Nadia let herself believe that this was the turning point, that new life would demand new priorities. Privately, Silas's warmth cooled into calculation. The pregnancy complicated everything he'd been carefully compartmentalizing: Bianca's expectations, his mother's control, his own craving for admiration without accountability. He oscillated between attentiveness and distance, between declarations of devotion and long, unexplained absences. When Nadia spoke about appointments or future plans, Silas responded vaguely, redirecting conversations toward logistics rather than emotions. He celebrated the news with the right people and withheld it from others, managing perception while avoiding commitment. Nadia noticed the contradiction. The man who smiled brightly in front of friends withdrew in private, as though the responsibility frightened him. She wondered if fear was natural or if something deeper was being hidden from her, something the pregnancy had only exposed. Judith's reaction erased any remaining illusions. She congratulated Nadia with a smile that felt procedural, immediately pivoting to concerns about timing, optics, and discretion. She spoke of announcements, press, and narratives, never of health or joy. The baby was framed as a liability to be managed, not a blessing to be celebrated. Judith questioned Nadia's capacity to handle the scrutiny, implying stress could be disruptive if not properly controlled. In that moment, Nadia understood that motherhood would not shield her here, it would be used. The hope that a child might bridge divides dissolved into a colder realization. The Hartwell family saw pregnancy as leverage. And Silas, standing silently beside his mother, allowed that truth to settle without protest. Bianca's presence in Silas's life grew bolder, no longer content with existing only in the margins. She refined her approach carefully, presenting herself as understanding rather than demanding, supportive rather than confrontational. In private conversations, she reframed Nadia as fragile and volatile, suggesting that the pregnancy had made her unpredictable and difficult to manage. Bianca spoke softly about stress, about how pressure could distort relationships, positioning Silas as a man trapped between obligation and happiness. She never asked him to leave his wife outright. Instead, she painted herself as the place where he could breathe. Silas absorbed these narratives eagerly, relieved to have his discomfort validated without being challenged. Each affirmation Bianca offered became another layer of poison, sweetened enough to swallow without resistance. Bianca's social circle reinforced the illusion. Friends who thrived on proximity to power echoed her sentiments, praising Silas's patience and subtly questioning Nadia's stability. In these settings, cruelty was dressed as concern, and betrayal disguised itself as empathy. Silas found himself enjoying the admiration, the way these people laughed at his jokes and listened to his complaints without asking him to be better. The contrast between Bianca's effortless approval and Nadia's quiet expectations became stark. Where Nadia asked for honesty and presence, Bianca offered escape. Silas didn't see the trap forming, he only felt understood. In choosing comfort over accountability, he began rewriting his own story, casting himself as a victim of circumstance rather than an architect of harm. At home, the consequences were unmistakable. Silas stayed out late, returning with vague explanations that changed depending on the day. When Nadia expressed concern, he dismissed her gently at first, then with irritation. He accused her of being overly sensitive, of reading into things that weren't there. Conversations that once felt collaborative turned defensive, punctuated by sighs and silences. Nadia felt herself shrinking within the marriage, her needs reframed as burdens. Isolation crept in quietly, amplified by Judith's scrutiny and Silas's withdrawal. Though nothing concrete had been revealed, Nadia sensed a shift that words couldn't disguise. The home grew colder, not from open conflict, but from the steady erosion of trust, an erosion fueled by Bianca's sweet poison and Silas's willingness to drink it. The Hartwell family dinner was announced with the formality of a summons rather than an invitation. Nadia prepared carefully, choosing comfort over show, mindful of her pregnancy and determined not to give Judith any reason to criticize her appearance. The dining room filled with extended relatives, associates, and familiar faces who measured worth through silence and observation. Judith presided at the head of the table, directing conversation with subtle authority. As courses were served, she made pointed remarks about discipline during pregnancy, questioning Nadia's food choices and commenting loudly on how excessive indulgence reflected poorly on family image. Each comment was delivered with a smile, inviting agreement while placing Nadia under scrutiny. The room grew tense, and Nadia felt every pair of eyes weighing her response. When Judith shifted from implication to open undermining, questioning Nadia's stamina, her emotional resilience, and whether she was suited for Hartwell expectations, something in Nadia steadied rather than broke. She spoke calmly, her voice firm but respectful, asserting her right to prioritize her health and her child. The table fell silent. No one interrupted, no one defended her. Nadia's words were not an attack, but they challenged the hierarchy by refusing submission. For a fleeting moment, she believed Silas would finally step in, that he would recognize the line that had been crossed. She looked to him, searching his face for reassurance, for partnership, for any sign that marriage meant standing together. Silas cleared his throat and chose the worst possible response. He sided with his mother, framing Nadia's words as emotional overreaction and suggesting that stress was clouding her judgment. His tone was calm, practiced, and devastating. Judith nodded approvingly, the power dynamic restored. Nadia felt something fundamental shift, not heartbreak, but clarity. The dinner continued awkwardly, but Nadia barely heard the conversation anymore. She understood then that silence was not neutrality, it was a decision. In that moment, Nadia realized she was navigating this marriage alone, and the knowledge settled heavily. The house had not merely judged her, it had chosen against her, and Silas had made himself part of that choice. Tessa's concern finally crystallized into certainty the night she connected patterns she could no longer ignore. What began as casual curiosity hardened into focused scrutiny as she traced Bianca Rowe's social footprint across cities and circles. Names repeated, timelines overlapped, and familiar outcomes surfaced, marriages strained, reputations quietly smeared, assets shifted under pressure. Tessa didn't dramatize her findings when she met Nadia, she laid them out carefully, letting facts speak. Bianca had a history of aligning herself with married men of means, presenting as supportive confidant before repositioning wives as liabilities. Tessa emphasized restraint, urging Nadia not to confront anyone yet. Information, she reminded her, was power only when used at the right moment. Nadia listened, her fear tempered by resolve, realizing the isolation she felt was not accidental but engineered. Around the same time, Nadia attended her first comprehensive prenatal appointment with Dr. Reuben Shaw, whose calm presence immediately put her at ease. He asked thoughtful questions, listened closely, and noticed signs of prolonged stress that Nadia had normalized. Without judgment, he explained how sustained emotional strain could affect pregnancy and urged her to prioritize safety, physical and emotional. When Nadia mentioned tensions at home, Dr. Shaw documented carefully, advising her to keep records and to speak up if she ever felt unsafe. His professionalism felt grounding, a contrast to the dismissals she'd grown used to. Nadia left the clinic feeling seen, carrying not just medical guidance but the quiet assurance that someone would take her seriously if she needed help. The real shift came when Nadia noticed irregularities she hadn't been looking for until now. Financial mail arrived addressed to Silas that never made it to shared spaces. Conversations about routine expenses became evasive. A file left open on a laptop revealed documents she didn't recognize, revisions, transfers, language that felt deliberately opaque. Nadia didn't understand the details yet, but instinct told her something was being moved without her knowledge. She copied nothing, confronted no one. Instead, she noted dates, names, and changes. What started as documentation for personal protection now expanded into something larger. The house that had judged her so freely was hiding secrets of its own, and Nadia sensed that the truth, once uncovered, would change the balance of power entirely. The confrontation erupted on an afternoon that had begun deceptively calm. Nadia had returned from a prenatal checkup carrying quiet resolve, determined to set boundaries without raising her voice. Judith was already waiting in the sitting room, posture rigid, expression sharpened by weeks of restrained hostility. Words were exchanged quickly, accusations about loyalty, insinuations about gratitude, and a final, cutting declaration that Nadia had never truly belonged. Judith's voice rose, stripping civility from every syllable as she dismissed Nadia as an outsider who had overstepped her place. The room felt charged, brittle with years of unspoken contempt. When Nadia attempted to step past her, Judith moved abruptly, the motion fueled by rage rather than reason, and shoved her with enough force to send her stumbling backward. The world tilted, breath knocked from her lungs as she fell, shock eclipsing pain. Silas stood frozen just steps away. He watched as Nadia struggled to sit up, confusion and fear crossing her face as she realized something was wrong. His hands remained at his sides, his expression locked between disbelief and cowardice. He said nothing, not to his mother, not to his wife. The silence was louder than any insult Judith had hurled. In that suspended moment, Nadia understood that abandonment did not always announce itself loudly, sometimes it arrived in stillness, in the refusal to act. Judith loomed over her, breathing hard, already shifting blame in her mind. Silas's inaction carved itself into Nadia's memory with brutal clarity. Whatever hope remained that marriage meant protection dissolved completely as she saw, without illusion, where his loyalty lay. Chaos followed quickly. Someone called for help, voices overlapping as panic replaced authority. An ambulance arrived, lights flashing against the Hartwell facade as paramedics worked with controlled urgency. Dr. Rubenshaw met them at the hospital, his calm demeanor anchoring the moment as he assessed Nadia and coordinated care. Though details were kept clinical and precise, the emotional weight was undeniable. As Nadia lay under observation, fear gave way to a colder, steadier resolve. Trust had been broken beyond repair, not by the push alone, but by the choice to watch and do nothing. In that hospital room, surrounded by sterile light and measured voices, Nadia understood that survival now meant separation, from illusions, from silence, and from the family that had just shown her exactly how little she mattered to them. Silas did not return home with Nadia when she was discharged. Instead, he sent a message framed in concern but empty of accountability, explaining that space would be best for everyone while things settled. That night, he went to Bianca. The decision, once unthinkable, now felt inevitable to him, an escape he justified as self-preservation. Bianca received him with practiced sympathy, validating his fear and reframing the incident as an unfortunate overreaction blown out of proportion. In public-facing circles, Silas began appearing beside Bianca without caution, choosing optics over decency. He spoke of stress, of misunderstandings, of a marriage strained by emotion, never once acknowledging his inaction. By morning, his choice was unmistakable: presence with Bianca, distance from his wife. Judith moved swiftly to control the narrative. She described the fall as a dramatic episode, suggesting Nadia had been unstable and careless. Aunt Celeste supported the version seamlessly, echoing concern while planting doubt about Nadia's reliability. The household staff was instructed to speak cautiously, reminders delivered with smiles that carried warnings beneath them. Judith's focus was not remorse but containment, protecting the Hartwell image at all costs. Silas, emboldened by his mother's certainty, repeated the language she provided, claiming that Nadia's stress had made cohabitation unsafe. Each retelling sharpened the lie, sanding away responsibility until Judith's push became invisible. In the Hardwell world, truth was malleable, shaped to preserve authority rather than reflect reality. For Nadia, the separation was not framed as abandonment but necessity. Dr. Shaw recommended a calmer environment, and the decision was presented as medical prudence rather than consequence. Nadia went to Tessa's apartment, carrying only essentials and the weight of what had been taken from her. There, away from surveillance and judgment, she began to breathe again. The fear lingered, but so did something new: focus. With Tessa's support, Nadia outlined practical steps: documentation, communication boundaries, and contingency planning centered on safety and stability. She did not plot revenge, she planned survival. The shift was subtle but profound. What the Hardwells saw as exile became Nadia's clearing, a place where resolve could finally grow without interruption. Dr. Reuben Shaw refused to let the incident dissolve into rumor or reinterpretation. From the moment Nadia was admitted, he had followed protocol with meticulous care, documenting every observation, every statement, every timeline detail with clinical precision. He noted the emotional distress, the context Nadia provided, and the circumstances surrounding the fall, refusing to accept vague explanations that minimized responsibility. When approached indirectly with suggestions to simplify the report, Dr. Shaw declined calmly, reminding anyone who asked that medical records were not tools for reputation management. His integrity was quiet but unyielding, and it created a paper trail that could not be erased by influence. Nadia learned of his stance later, and for the first time since the incident, she felt something close to relief. Someone had seen the truth and preserved it without asking her to fight alone. Miles confronted Silas days later in a tense exchange that stripped away pretense. They met in the garage where honesty still lived, and Miles did not soften his words. He accused Silas of cowardice, of choosing comfort over decency, and of allowing their mother's cruelty to define him. The confrontation was verbal, controlled but fierce, fueled by years of restrained frustration. Silas responded defensively, accusing Miles of misunderstanding and exaggeration, clinging to the narrative Judith had crafted. He framed his silence as shock, his distance as necessity, refusing to acknowledge the harm done. The conversation ended without reconciliation, but something irreversible shifted. Miles understood then that his brother had chosen allegiance over conscience, and that loyalty to blood did not obligate silence in the face of wrongdoing. Meanwhile, Detective Alana Pierce entered the periphery of Nadia's life through an unrelated inquiry tied to a disturbance report at the Hardwell estate. Her approach was methodical, her questions deceptively casual. She noticed discrepancies, timelines that didn't align, accounts that shifted depending on the speaker. Without making promises, she listened. Patterns emerged quietly as she compared notes, recognizing echoes of control and suppression she had seen before. Alana did not rush conclusions, she gathered context, allowing the truth to surface organically. By the time she reached out to Nadia for a formal statement, it was clear this was no isolated incident. The case was no longer just about a fall, it was about a system that protected power by silencing those it harmed. And the witnesses, once scattered and hesitant, were beginning to wake. What Nadia uncovered next was not discovered through confrontation but through patience. While staying with Tessa, she revisited the fragments she had quietly noted over weeks: unfamiliar documents, evasive answers, subtle shifts in household routines. With help from a trusted legal referral Tessa arranged, Nadia learned how to read what had once looked like meaningless paperwork. The Hardwell empire, celebrated publicly as pristine and ethical, was sustained by layered intimidation tactics, non-disclosure pressure, coercive settlements, and quiet financial rerouting that protected Judith's authority. What shocked Nadia most was not the existence of wrongdoing, but how methodically it had been normalized. Judith had not merely overseen these operations, she had orchestrated them, using fear and loyalty as currency. The family's power was less about wealth than control, and Nadia had unknowingly stepped into a structure designed to crush dissent. The deeper twist emerged when Nadia's pregnancy intersected with legacy law. A clause embedded within old Hardwell agreements, intentionally obscured and rarely triggered, shifted certain rights once a legal spouse bore a direct heir. Silas had known about it. He had signed documents acknowledging its implications long before Nadia became pregnant, yet he never disclosed them. The clause didn't grant instant ownership or power, but it disrupted long-standing protections Judith relied on to rule unchallenged. Nadia realized then why financial movements had accelerated and why pressure against her had intensified after the pregnancy announcement. Her presence, and her child, represented unpredictability in a system that thrived on rigid order. The realization reframed everything. The hostility was not personal alone, it was strategic. Bianca sensed the shift before she understood it. Silas grew anxious, distracted, increasingly desperate to secure assets and assurances that once came effortlessly. Bianca pushed harder, urging him to finalize arrangements, to distance himself legally as well as emotionally. Her encouragement revealed impatience rather than devotion, and Silas felt it. For the first time, doubt crept into his confidence, about Bianca's motives, about his mother's infallibility, about the choices he had made in silence. Nadia, meanwhile, did not rush forward. She absorbed the truth carefully, knowing timing mattered. The Hartwell name had always relied on secrecy and speed. Nadia would rely on clarity and restraint. And in that quiet difference, the balance of power began to tilt. Labor began before dawn, quietly at first, like a tide pulling back before a wave. Nadia focused on breathing through the early contractions, grounding herself in the routines Dr. Reuben Shaw had taught her. The hospital room filled with measured urgency as nurses moved efficiently, voices calm and reassuring. Pain came in surges, but fear did not dominate, resolve did. Nadia held on to the thought that this moment belonged to her and her child, not to the family that had tried to erase her. When the baby arrived, the room softened. The sound, small, insistent, alive, cut through weeks of dread. Nadia wept, not from relief alone, but from the realization that something unassailable had entered the world. The birth was non-graphic yet profound, a turning point that transformed endurance into purpose. Silas arrived later, careful and composed, the way he appeared when cameras or reputations might be watching. He offered flowers, spoke gently to staff, and presented concern with practiced ease. In the room, he praised Nadia's strength while avoiding her eyes, already rehearsing how the moment would be described elsewhere. He took photographs, asked about updates he could share, and stayed just long enough to look supportive without being accountable. When conversations drifted toward next steps, boundaries, care plans, commitments, he deflected, citing pressure and the need for discretion. His public tenderness contrasted sharply with private detachment, and Nadia noticed how quickly he returned to his phone, to messages that pulled him elsewhere. The performance was convincing to outsiders, but to Nadia, it rang hollow. With the baby resting safely, Nadia began to set boundaries quietly and decisively. She authorized documentation that clarified custody protections and medical consent, following guidance she had prepared for this exact moment. She limited communication to written channels, ensuring clarity and accountability. Tessa coordinated logistics, while Miles checked in with restrained concern, careful not to overstep. Nadia did not demand change from Silas, she planned around his predictability. The war she recognized now was not loud or impulsive, it was procedural, strategic, and patient. In choosing structure over pleading, Nadia reclaimed agency. The arrival of her child did not soften the conflict, it clarified it. And with that clarity came the certainty that she would not be outmaneuvered again. The first blow landed quietly, disguised as routine correspondence. Notices arrived to the Hartwell offices citing compliance reviews, followed by requests that could not be postponed or redirected. Accounts were flagged pending verification, transactions slowed, then stopped. What Judith had always dismissed as administrative noise hardened into scrutiny that did not bend to influence. Investigators requested records spanning years, asking for explanations that could not be smoothed over with charm. Leaks followed, not sensational, but precise, documents appearing in the right hands at the right time, staining the family's reputation with questions rather than accusations. The Hartwell name, once protected by silence and speed, found itself exposed to daylight where patterns could be traced and timelines aligned. What Judith had built through intimidation now unraveled through procedure, the kind she could not shout down. Witnesses emerged with measured courage. Household staff who had learned to avert their eyes shared accounts that matched in unsettling detail. A former associate Judith had sidelined years earlier stepped forward, corroborating methods of pressure and retaliation. Detective Alana Pierce assembled the pieces without theatrics, letting consistency do the work. Each statement strengthened the next, forming a narrative that no single denial could dismantle. Judith's authority faltered as rooms once filled by her certainty grew cautious. She attempted to reassert control, summoning attorneys, issuing directives, but her voice no longer commanded obedience. The structure that had protected her depended on fear remaining private. Once witnesses spoke in chorus, fear lost its currency. Bianca made her move as the ground shifted, believing speed could outrun consequence. She pressed Silas to secure what he could, urging transfers and promises that revealed urgency rather than loyalty. When funds failed to clear and assurances came back conditional, she pivoted, attempting to exit with whatever leverage remained. The attempt backfired. Communications were logged, timelines preserved, intentions exposed. Silas watched the illusion collapse in real time, recognizing too late that devotion had always been transactional. As doors closed across the Hartwell empire, karma did not announce itself with spectacle. It arrived as process, inevitable, indifferent, and exact, opening doors Nadia had not forced and closing ones Judith could no longer hold. Silas's unraveling was not dramatic, it was incremental and deeply humiliating. Invitations stopped arriving. Calls went unanswered. Meetings that once opened doors now ended with polite deferrals and tightened smiles. Access, his true currency, evaporated. He learned quickly that the respect he enjoyed had never been personal, it was borrowed from the Hartwell name and Judith's reach. As investigations advanced, his explanations sounded thin even to himself. Bianca's absence became permanent, her messages replaced by legal cautions and silence. In the quiet that followed, Silas faced a realization he had avoided for years: no one was coming to protect him. The admiration he chased had been conditional, and once conditions changed, so did loyalty. The cost of watching and doing nothing finally came due. Judith confronted consequences she could not intimidate away. The authority she wielded through fear collapsed as those once dependent on her spoke openly. Attorneys who had shielded her now advised restraint. Rooms she once dominated felt colder, emptier. The family throne she guarded had always depended on secrecy and obedience. Once both eroded, so did her control. Attempts to reframe events met firm resistance, and narratives she crafted were challenged by documented facts. Judith discovered that power sustained by silence does not survive testimony. The loneliness that followed was not imposed by punishment alone but by recognition. People had complied, not believed. And when compliance ended, nothing remained to anchor her reign. Nadia moved forward with measured confidence, supported by Tessa's unwavering loyalty, Miles's quiet integrity, and Dr. Reuben Shaw's consistent truth-telling. She did not celebrate the collapse she witnessed, she organized her life around safety, clarity, and her child's future. Legal protections settled into place, communications remained precise, and decisions were made without spectacle. Nadia's strength was not loud, it was disciplined. In choosing structure over revenge, she stepped into a future she had never imagined but now commanded. The watchers who once judged her had fallen, not because she shouted, but because she endured, documented, and waited for daylight to do its work. Nadia's new life did not arrive with fanfare or public vindication. It unfolded quietly, shaped by intention rather than reaction. She settled into a home that felt human instead of performative, where mornings were guided by her child's rhythms and evenings by peace she no longer had to defend. The routines she rebuilt were simple but profound, walks that cleared her mind, baking that returned joy to her hands, and plans that centered stability instead of survival. Family, she learned, was not defined by bloodlines or surnames, but by consistency and care. The people who showed up without conditions became her foundation. Nadia did not erase the past, she placed it where it belonged, behind her, no longer steering her choices. Silas lived with the long shadow of his decisions, a consequence that followed him more persistently than any formal judgment. Opportunities he once took for granted were closed, and relationships he assumed permanent proved conditional. Without Judith's reach to buffer him, he faced the discomfort of accountability and the loneliness of recognition. Judith, in turn, confronted the quiet aftermath of an empire built on control. The rooms she once commanded were silent, her authority replaced by distance. Neither found solace in excuses, the cost of prioritizing power over people could not be negotiated away. Their karma was not spectacle, it was permanence, a reality that asked nothing and forgave nothing. For Nadia, transformation was not about proving worth to those who denied it. It was about building a life that required no permission. She watched her child grow, anchored by choices made with clarity and care. Her future unfolded steadily, shaped by boundaries that protected peace and values that honored truth. Nadia did not seek revenge. She claimed justice by living well, by refusing to shrink, and by choosing love that was present and accountable. In the end, her victory was not the fall of those who wronged her, but the rise of a home where trust lived freely, and where forever, once believed in quietly, finally made sense. Thank you for listening to Luxurious Tales, where every story carries meaning and every lesson echoes beyond the ending. If this tale moved you, share it with someone, leave a comment, and let us know what you felt. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time, remember, every tale has a lesson, and every ending is only the beginning.